February 19th, 1945, Iwo Jima. Black sand, no cover, no mercy. The first wave of Marines steps off the landing craft and instantly sinks ankle-deep into volcanic ash that eats their boots and slows their run to a crawl. Machine gun fire scythes across the beach from hidden holes in the cliffs. Men fold and vanish into the sand as if the island itself is swallowing them. Near the rear of one Amtrak, a young Marine in scuffed combat gear kneels over a bulky field radio, one hand steadying the antenna, the other clutching a handset. His name is Corporal Henry Bake Jr, Navajo, U.S. Marine Corps, 5th Division. He squints through sulphurous smoke that burns his eyes and tears his throat, listening to a chaotic storm of English call signs and static in his headset. Then he does something no Japanese codebreaker has ever trained for. He closes his eyes and begins to speak softly, in Navajo. The words sound like something from another world. Harsh consonants, rising and falling tones, a rhythm closer to a ceremony than a fire mission. To the Japanese intelligence officers monitoring the frequencies from their tunnels under Mount Suribachi, these sounds are meaningless noise, some kind of strange chant from a people they have never even heard of. But to the Marine artillery liaison crouched behind a sand dune near the waterline, those same sounds are a map of death. Henry's message translates to coordinates, targets, and timings for 105mm howitzers to hit pillboxes carved into the mountain. Within seconds, the answer comes back. Steel. The island shakes as American guns from offshore ships and beach batteries roar to life. High above, the grey sky flashes white as explosions walk up the slope of Suribachi like steps. You can almost feel the impact in your chest, the dull, concussive thump that compresses your lungs and rattles your teeth. For most of the Marines on the beach, this is just artillery finally doing its job. For Henry, it is something else entirely, because the code he is speaking is his language. The language teachers once slapped from his mouth. The language his people were told to bury. The same words his grandmother whispered over him at night in a small hogan in the high desert of Arizona, now driving shells into the heart of the Empire of Japan. Section 2. The language they tried to erase. Years earlier, before the black sand and the stench of burning oil, there was the whip of cold wind across the mesas of the Navajo Nation. Henry was 10 when they first dragged him from his home. A government truck rolled up to the family's sheep camp, tires crunching over the dusty ground, and men in uniforms stepped out with papers and forced smiles. They told his parents, half in English, half in broken Navajo, that the boy had to go to school, that he needed to learn proper language, proper ways. At the boarding school, the rules were simple and brutal. Speak English, forget your own words, speak Navajo, and you are punished. The first time Henry slipped and answered another boy in Navajo, a supervisor grabbed him by the collar, hauled him into the hallway, and forced him to stand for hours with a bar of soap in his mouth until his gums bled. The taste of lie and humiliation burned itself into his memory. He learned to answer in English. Yes, sir. No, sir. But inside his head, the old words stayed. His grandmother's prayers, clan names, stories of the Diné emerging into this world. Years later, when he raised his right hand and joined the Marine Corps after Pearl Harbor, he never imagined that the same language the school tried to beat out of him would become the weapon the Marines needed most. At Camp Elliott in California, Henry found himself in a group of Navajo recruits herded into a rough wooden building with maps tacked to the walls and a blackboard at the front. A Marine officer, Major James E. Jones, paced in front of them, explaining that the Corps needed a code that the Japanese could never crack. They had tried technical ciphers, machines, complex systems. Everything took too long in combat. They needed speed. They needed secrecy. They needed something no enemy had ever heard before. They needed Navajo. The first group of 29 Navajo Marines, men like Chester Nez, Carl Gorman, Peter MacDonald, sat together and began building the code from scratch. They mapped Navajo words to military terms, turtle for tank, ironfish for submarine, hummingbird for fighter plane. They took the alphabet and assigned Navajo words as phonetic stand-ins: Walachi for A, Belasana for B, Senil for C. No Japanese linguist had ever studied this language. No dictionary existed. No outsider had a complete record of its structure. It was oral, living, fluid. Henry joined them later, part of the expanding network of code talkers. He trained until the words and meanings fused, not just as language anymore, but as a rapid-fire code he could recall under fire, sweat in his eyes, hands shaking, men dying around him. On the hot training ranges, instructors ran brutal drills. Translate this target grid, Navajo to English, now back, faster, faster. If he hesitated, he was shouted at, made to run, forced to repeat. But this time, when he spoke Navajo, no one struck him. They praised him. For the first time, the language they tried to erase became the most valuable thing he possessed. Section 3. Across the Pacific, Ghost Voices on the Air. Before Iwo Jima, there were other islands: Guadalcanal, Bougainville, Tarawa, Saipan, Tinian, Peleliu. Names that tasted like mud, blood, and salt. On Guadalcanal, the code talkers sent hundreds of messages during the desperate battles for Henderson Field, directing airstrikes, coordinating units as Japanese forces hurled themselves against the marine perimeter in screaming nighttime banzai charges. On Saipan, they called in artillery onto caves packed with stubborn defenders. On Tarawa, they tried to untangle the chaos when hundreds of Marines died in the surf, trapped on coral reefs under machine gun fire. Everywhere they went, the pattern repeated: attack, chaos, static. Then calm voices in Navajo, cutting through the noise like a knife. Henry learned how to tune his mind to the rhythm of combat. Wait, listen, speak. Wait, listen, speak. Most code talkers worked in pairs, one sending, one receiving, back and forth, a chain of voices stretching from ship to shore to foxhole to CP. They carried heavy TBX or TBY radios, with awkward antennas and spare batteries that seemed to weigh more than rifles. When they spoke English on the line, Japanese eavesdroppers could translate. But when they switched to Navajo, the enemy only heard ghosts. Japanese intelligence was not stupid. Men like Captain Yamauchi had cracked British and American codes before. They could recognize encryption patterns. They could identify frequency usage, traffic patterns, signaling habits. But this wasn't like anything they knew. The syllables were rapid, unfamiliar, and layered with sounds their analytic formulas didn't account for. Even if they somehow captured a Navajo, extracting a workable lexicon in the middle of the war would have been nearly impossible, especially under the clock of constant marine advances and airstrikes. On one island after another, the code talkers proved two things. They were fast. A message that might take an hour to encrypt and decrypt on a machine could be sent and understood in seconds. And they were secure. The Japanese never broke the code. By the time the American High Command began planning the invasion of Iwo Jima, the code talkers were no longer an experiment. They were a secret weapon. Section 4. The Mountain of Fire. Back on Iwo Jima, Henry wipes the sweat from his upper lip with a trembling thumb. The air tastes metallic, like hot pennies. The beachhead behind him is a mess of wrecked landing craft, burning Shermans, and bodies half buried in the powdery sand. Everywhere he looks there is movement, figures running crouched, dragging wounded, shouting, firing, but his world has narrowed to the radio on his lap, and the silhouette of Mount Suribachi towering over everything like a black tooth. From deep inside the bowels of that mountain, where tunnels honeycomb the rock and artillery chambers have been carved by hand over months, Captain Yamauchi leans over his own radio set, headphones crooked on his ears. Around him, cramped Japanese soldiers drip sweat in the suffocating heat, their uniforms stained with dust and smoke. An operator switches frequencies, trying to track the Americans. English crackles in, call signs, coordinates. Then the strange language appears again. Yamauchi scowls. His linguists scribble frantically, filling pages with symbols. They attempt to break the sounds into components, identifying repeated patterns, trying to guess what might be numbers, what might be place names. But they cannot even be sure where one word ends and another begins. Could it be some sort of native language? One of the analysts suggests. A tribe? An Indian dialect? Yamauchi hesitates. The Japanese had studied English, some Spanish, even Russian. But Navajo? No one had ever even proposed it as a military language. He orders a directive sent up the chain. Capture one of these radio men alive. That command moves like electricity through the caves. On the surface, under the sun, it translates into sudden, vicious night raids aimed at command posts and communication hubs where big antennas poke above sand and rock. Henry feels that danger closing in even as he continues to speak. Send fire here. Shift the line. Reinforce this sector. In Navajo, it comes out like a chant, a steady stream of clipped syllables. He is not just keeping his fellow Marines alive, he is feeding the guns that are slowly prying this island out of Japan's hands. Section 5. Night of Knives. The first real test comes on the third night. By then, Henry has barely slept. His eyes are bloodshot, his hands cramped from gripping the handset. He hears explosions in his dreams even when he's awake, phantom sounds overlapping the real ones. Beside him in the foxhole, PFC Samuel Tso breathes in harsh little gasps as he fights off a fever. Dysentery has swept through the lines. The latrines are shallow pits not far from where they sleep. Flies gather. The stench is ever present. Over their heads, flares bloom and fade, bathing the landscape in ghostly white. In that stark light, the battlefield looks almost unreal. Jagged rock, twisted barbed wire, shattered trees, and the hulking forms of dead tanks half buried in ash. Somewhere out there, Japanese soldiers are crawling forward, their bayonets wrapped in rags to stop them from glinting, their boots stripped off so their feet make no sound. The Marines call them creepers. Henry and Tso hear a different kind of noise, small scuffs, the faintest crunch of ash, whispered Japanese close enough to feel on their skin. A chill slides down Henry's spine. He lowers the handset, fingers brushing the grip of his pistol. A figure looms at the lip of the foxhole. For one frozen instant, Henry sees a face. Young, dirt-streaked, eyes wild, teeth clenched around a grenade pin. The world erupts in motion. Tso lunges, knocking the blade aside. Henry draws and fires, the muzzle flash blinding in the dark, the sound impossibly loud in the confined space. The Japanese soldier falls on top of them, dead weight, breath leaving his lungs in a rattling sigh. More figures appear behind him. The foxhole becomes a vortex of shouting, gunshots and thrashing bodies. Marines from neighbouring positions open up with rifles and BARs. Tracer rounds carve lines of light across the night. Some of the infiltrators reach other holes. Men die quietly in the dark, throats cut before they can even shout. When the fight finally ebbs, Henry is slicked with blood that isn't his. His ears ring, his hands shake. Tso has a deep slice along his leg where a bayonet grazed him. "Need corpsman," Tso groans. Henry hesitates only a moment before picking up the handset again. Even now, even after almost being killed in his sleep, his first instinct is to translate the chaos into code and send it up the line. Positions overrun, wounded, need help. The reply comes. The casualty collection team is on the way. As they wait, Henry realizes something. If the Japanese had taken him alive tonight, tied him up, dragged him into one of their caves, there is a chance that, under torture, they might have tried to rip the language out of him. How much does a man give up when pain becomes the only thing left? He squeezes his eyes shut, hearing his grandmother's voice, clear as if she's right beside him. Your words are your breath. Your breath is your life. Do not give either to the enemy. In the distance, artillery rumbles. The island groans. And still, the code holds. Section 6. The mountain breaks, the code endures. Days blur. Suribachi finally falls, the flag raising captured in a frozen moment of 6 Marines pushing a pole into the rocky ground. Henry doesn't see it happen. He's too busy relaying coordinates for units dug in around the mountain's base, where Japanese pockets keep fighting long after the flag goes up. The battle shifts north toward the airfields. The terrain becomes a hellscape of shattered rock and hidden caves where defenders fight until they are burned or blasted out. Henry and the other code talkers are constantly on the move now, relocating with each push, lugging their radios on sore backs, weaving antenna wires through the ruins. Everywhere they go, they leave a trail of invisible conversations in the air. Orders for flanking attacks, requests for airstrikes, warnings of ambushes. Each one in Navajo, each one indecipherable to the enemy. In his tunnels, Captain Yamauchi sits hunched over a stack of useless notes, pages and pages of symbols and attempted transcriptions that never coalesce into meaning. Around him, soldiers are running out of food, out of water, out of ammunition. He understands enough about war to realize what these voices mean. The Americans have found a way to speak openly in front of him while he listens, and still tell him nothing. It is the ultimate insult to an intelligence officer. On the day Yamauchi chooses to die rather than surrender, he leaves his records behind. Later, when Allied teams recover the documents after the war, they will see the desperate attempts to break the Indian Code. They will also see that he never got close. Section 7. After the guns go silent. When Iwo Jima is finally declared secure, Henry stands on a ridge overlooking one of the airfields. The runways are scarred, cratered, still being patched by construction battalions. In the weeks and months to come, those strips of asphalt will become lifelines, emergency landing sites for damaged B-29 superfortresses limping back from firebombing raids over Tokyo. Thousands of airmen will survive because of this tiny island. Henry thinks of that as he watches the first plane touch down, wheels kicking up dust. He thinks of the messages he sent, the shells they brought down, the men who died all around him. He also thinks of his grandmother, her hands rough from work, holding his face gently as she taught him the old songs. He survived. The language survived, and it helped win the war. But there is a bitter twist. The code remains classified. Henry returns home after the war not as a celebrated hero, but as another veteran told to move on, to get a job, to restart his life. He cannot tell anyone what he really did. He cannot explain why he still hears Navajo words echoing in his dreams, not as prayers this time, but as artillery coordinates. Decades pass. Only in 1968, when the government finally declassifies the program, do the Code Talkers begin to receive public recognition. A trickle of articles, then books, then medals. By then, many of the original men are old. Some have already died, their stories buried with them. Henry, like so many of them, has spent years working ordinary jobs, ranching, driving trucks, serving on tribal councils. But when he finally stands before a crowd and hears someone say the words Navajo Code Talker out loud with respect, something inside him unclenches. The language that boarding schools tried to erase, that war tried to break, is still there. In classrooms on the reservation, new generations are learning it again, not as something to be ashamed of, but as something that once turned the tide of a world war. Section 8. The Unbreakable Prayer. Imagine for a moment tuning a radio to a random frequency above a battlefield in 1945. You would hear panic, you would hear fear, you would hear confusion. And then, cutting through all of that, you would hear a calm voice in Navajo, describing a world the Japanese could not see, in a language they could not understand. To them, it might have sounded like a spell, a curse, the mutterings of demons. To the Marines on the ground, it was something else. It was clarity, it was coordination, it was survival. It was, in a very real sense, a prayer. A prayer spoken in the oldest words of a people who had lived through attempts to erase them, now using those same words to help end the most destructive war in human history. The Navajo Code Talkers never had the luxury of thinking of themselves as legends. In their minds, they were just doing their job, carrying a radio, sending messages, keeping their brothers alive. But if you look closely at their story, you see something bigger. A language that refused to die, a people who refused to forget, and an enemy who, For all their machines, all their analysts, all their power, never cracked a single word.